In the archive of the county's Citizen Appeals Department, there is an entry dated August 14th that no one considered important at the time. On paper, it is an ordinary line in a long list of complaints, a concise formulation without details. Complaint about a smell. Maple Street, House 112. Dispatch an inspector. But today, this line is seen as the starting point in the case that would later be called the most sensational of the decade. At 1947, a man named Tom Brower called the dispatch center. He has lived on Maple Street for over 10 years. According to him, for the last 3 evenings in a row, a pungent chemical smell hung in the air, coming from the direction of the neighboring property. Tom did not sound alarmed, just tired. He said that the smell intensified towards night, as if something was being heated or melted. He mentioned that it was impossible to air out the house because of it. Even the dog refused to go out into the yard. His statement was taken calmly. The operator logged the call and, following instructions, sent a notification to the sanitary service. Such complaints come in constantly. People burn trash, treat soil, spill solvents. Usually it all ends with a single visit. At 8:30 the next morning, a county public health inspector arrived on Maple Street. The smell was indeed noticeable. Thick, heavy, like a mixture of burning and decomposing fertilizers. But the source could not be found immediately. The house from which, according to the neighbor, the smell was coming belonged to Harold Collins. 48 years old, married, works as a logistics manager at a transport company. He has resided at this address since 1997. The house is neat, well kept, with fresh paint on the facade and roses under the windows. At first glance, a typical quiet, middle-class life. In the database, Collins was listed as impeccable. No debts, no complaints, no fines. The neighbor who called the service had never had any conflicts with him. The inspector approached the house, and within a minute, the owner himself came out from behind the garage. Collins looked composed. Jeans, gloves, a simple work shirt. He was not surprised by the visit. He immediately said that he guessed why they had come. It must be the smell from the fertilizer. I overdid it a bit. He explained that he had recently ordered a new mixture for his roses and decided to try it. He showed a bag standing by the wall which was indeed labeled Garden Pro. The conversation was calm. Collins spoke confidently, unhurriedly, answering all questions. He even offered the inspector to smell the fertilizer to be convinced that it was indeed unpleasant, but not dangerous. His behavior was absolutely typical. No irritation, no attempts to justify himself. Everything looked natural. The inspection of the property took no more than 20 minutes. The inspector noted that the ground in the yard was level, with no fresh pits or signs of burning. In the backyard were cucumber beds, 2 plastic water barrels, and neatly arranged garden tools. In the trash cans were mown grass and fertilizer packaging. On the surface, nothing was suspicious. The inspector's report stated, "Smell is present, but the source has not been identified. No violations of sanitary norms were found. The likely cause is the use of organic fertilizers. Observation recommended." After the inspection, the report was sent to the archives, and the case was considered closed. The neighbors soon confirmed that the smell weakened by evening and disappeared completely a day later. It all seemed like a trivial household matter. On Maple Street, life quickly returned to its usual course. People discussed the new supermarket, road repairs, the weather, but not the Collins property. No one even remembered the inspector's visit. Later, the investigation would establish, at that very moment, under that very property, lay what explained the origin of the smell. Back then, no one knew that the bag of fertilizer was just a cover. Collins had thought everything through in advance. from the explanation to his behavior during the inspection. He understood that the inspector would not dig deeper. The system worked according to instructions: complaint, inspection, report, archive. Everything correct, everything formal. But it was this procedure, which seemed ordinary, that left out the main thing. And if someone had become suspicious back then, the story might have gone differently. But no one became suspicious, and the smell that everyone mistook for fertilizer would return. Only then it would be too late to fix anything. In the small town where everyone knows each other by name, Harold Collins was what you would unhesitatingly call a reliable man. He never stood out, never sought attention, but was always there when help was needed. In municipal reports and meeting minutes, his name appeared often, not in connection with complaints, but on the contrary, in lists of active residents. He was a member of the local school's parent committee, participated in organizing the annual city festival, and voluntarily helped with repair work on community cleanup days. Neighbors recalled that he was the first to suggest collecting money if someone's garage burned down or medical treatment needed to be paid for. He participated in charity marathons, brought boxes of things for the shelter, and behaved like a person who cared about what was happening around him. In the evenings, especially in summer, Harold could often be seen in his yard. He tended the garden, mowed the lawn, and chatted with neighbors over the fence. More than once, he organized small get-togethers on the street, barbecues that brought together all the residents of the block. He was respected, but not feared. He was not the type of person who makes you feel a distance. On the contrary, you could always talk to him, ask for advice, or just exchange a few words about the weather or how the roses were growing that year. In official sources, Harold was described as a man of impeccable reputation. He had worked for the same company for over 10 years, was punctual and non-confrontational. He maintained even friendly relationships with his colleagues. Management characterized him as a quiet but extremely reliable employee. He did not argue, was never late, and never complained. The kind of person you could count on if a project needed to be finished urgently. In his family, everything looked just as stable. Neighbors often saw him pulling out of the garage in the morning, giving his wife a ride to work, and then stopping by the school. On weekends, church, dinner at the same cafe, grocery shopping at the supermarket. His life resembled a schedule where every minute was in its place. His wife, Linda, worked in accounting. They had met in college, bought a house together, paid off the mortgage, and raised 2 children. According to her colleagues' recollections, she often mentioned her husband. Reliable, level-headed. You feel calm with him. In group photos, a smile, matching sweaters, the backdrop of a family holiday. Nothing that would cause alarm or distrust. Neither in police reports nor in social services records was there a single report associated with the Collins address over all those years. No complaints from neighbors, no calls from the school. The house always looked neat. The meters were paid regularly and taxes were filed on time. If you asked anyone who lived nearby what kind of person Harold Collins was, the answer was always the same. Calm, kind, a family man. And that is precisely why what would later be revealed would come as a shock to everyone. Because this normal world of Harold's was one of those that look perfect, but are built on a flawless facade. A world where order is more important than emotions, where everything is controlled and packaged in the proper form. There is no room for accidents, no room for chaos. Everything is subordinate to habit, schedule, precision. It is this order, its external flawlessness, that would play a decisive role, because beneath the smooth surface, where everything seems calm, often hides what should not come out. And in Collins' story, this crack would soon appear. At first, barely noticeable, like a minor detail. And then it would become a line along which the entire facade of his normal life would begin to crumble. The problem that was considered resolved returned. Only now everything looked different. The smell, which had disappeared after the inspector's visit, reappeared. But if before it was only noticeable in the evenings, now it lingered around the clock. Neighbors began to notice that the air around the Collins house seemed to have become denser, heavier. Some described it as bitter, others as putrid, but everyone agreed on one thing. It did not resemble the smell of fertilizers. 5 days after the first inspection, another call came into the dispatch center. This time, the complaint came from a neighbor across the street, Mrs. Grant. She said the smell intensified as the sun went down, and that it was impossible to be outside because of it. 2 days after her, another resident of the block called, reporting the same thing. His statement included a new detail. He mentioned that from his attic window he had seen Collins dragging something to the back of the yard late in the evening. There, where several large blue plastic barrels now stood. These two signals became the basis for a second inspection. According to procedure, when complaints are repeated in a short period and point to the same location, the service is obliged to pass the information to the police. Thus, the case moved from a sanitary issue to the jurisdiction of law enforcement. The wording in the document sounded neutral. Inspection for possible unauthorized storage of chemical substances. But in reality, it no longer looked like a matter of property maintenance. A local officer, Officer James Hine, was sent to Maple Street. He arrived in the morning, around 8, just as Collins was unloading something from his trunk. According to him, the conversation started calmly. Hine introduced himself, explained that repeated complaints had been received. He asked what was in the containers standing against the back wall. Collins answered confidently without a hint of irritation. "It's chemicals for a pool. I'm planning to install one on the property. I bought the reagents in advance. There was a sale." He even showed one of the bags, supposedly containing chlorine powder, and began to explain where he would build the pool itself, right next to the flower beds. He spoke in detail, specifying dimensions, as if everything was indeed already planned. Hine noted that the yard was tidy, the barrels were covered with lids, and there were no leaks or spills. At first glance, everything looked convincing. But the officer, following protocol, made a standard inquiry to check if Collins had submitted an official application to install a pool. In the city, such structures require a permit, as they involve connecting to the water supply. The answer came back the same day. In the register of construction applications, not a single entry under the name Harold Collins was listed. Thus, his explanation was not supported by documents. Against the backdrop of this discrepancy, the officer filed a report and forwarded it to the investigations department. The wording remained neutral, discrepancy established in the citizen's testimony. But it was from this moment that the situation ceased to be merely administrative. Collins did not know that he would now be under observation. He did not know that his explanation, delivered almost casually, would become the first signal that the facade of his life had begun to crack. Everything still looked calm. He continued to go to work, tend to his garden, and talk to his neighbors. But now, every move he made was of interest to the police. This week would be the last that Maple Street would remain a quiet place. After this, events would begin to unfold quickly. Too quickly for anyone to realize just how far things had gone. After the discrepancy was discovered, Officer James Hine acted strictly according to instructions, although, as he would later say, he already knew internally that something was wrong. He compiled a detailed report, a document in which he recorded every little thing, even details that might have seemed insignificant at first glance. In the report, he noted the dates of the complaints, the names of the residents who had called the dispatch center, and emphasized that the smell was perceptible not only in the immediate vicinity of the Collins house, but also within a 30-meter radius. Next came a list of observations. 3 blue plastic containers standing by the back wall of the house, of identical size and without markings. Hein described the conversation with the owner in detail, how Harold spoke calmly, how he showed no anxiety, and how he explained the origin of these barrels with too much confidence. He even quoted his words in the report. "These are reagents for a pool. I bought them in advance at a discount, planning to install the structure in the spring." After this quote, the officer added a brief note. "There is no data on planned pool construction at this address in the registry." At the end of the document, Hein listed 3 key points: repeated citizen complaints pointing to a single source, the presence of a chemical smell persisting for more than 7 days, a false explanation from the property owner. He sent this report to his immediate superior, Captain Reeves. After reviewing the materials, Reeves noted in a memo, "The totality of the indicated circumstances requires an inspection that exceeds the scope of a sanitary inspection." On this basis, he initiated a request to the county prosecutor's office to authorize a search of the property. Usually, such requests are not processed instantly. The bureaucratic procedure takes time. But this time, the situation developed more quickly. The repeated complaints, as well as the fact that one of the residents had pointed to activity in the backyard at night, made the case a priority. In the prosecutor's office, such cases are classified as a potential environmental threat. Upon receiving the documents, the prosecutor requested the results of the previous visit from the sanitary service. It was stated there that the inspector had found no violations, but the source of the smell could not be determined. This uncertainty, combined with Collins' lie, served as an argument in favor of a full inspection. The prosecutor signed the request for a court order the very next day. In the court document sent to the county court, everything was stated in dry, formal language. Received citizen complaints and recorded facts indicate a possible violation of chemical storage regulations on the territory of a private house at the E, address Maple Street 112, for the purpose of establishing the source of contamination and verifying the legality of the use of said materials. I request that a permit be issued to conduct an inspection of the property. Judge Doyle, having received the materials, reviewed them the same day. He was an experienced lawyer, and dozens of similar cases had passed through his hands. But it was the combination of factors that alerted him: the repeated complaints, the lack of a permit, and the owner's contradictory explanations. The judge's decision read, "The totality of the circumstances creates sufficient grounds to believe that Citizen Collins may be storing substances that pose a threat to the health of those around him. Authorize an inspection with the involvement of representatives from the police, the prosecutor's office, and the forensic chemistry service." The next day, a meeting was held at the station. Captain Reeves assigned Hein to lead the team. He was joined by a chemical expert from the county laboratory, Michael Powell, and a junior investigator from the prosecutor's office, Ann Lawson, who was to be present during every action related to the inspection of private property. They were given a copy of the warrant, which specified an exact validity period, 48 hours. Within this time frame, the group was required to go to the site, conduct a visual inspection, take air samples, and if necessary, open the suspicious containers. The document contained no mention of a possible crime. The wording remained extremely dry. Inspection for possible violation of sanitary and environmental norms. But between the lines, a sense of caution could already be felt. On the evening of August 21st, the group gathered at the station building. They checked their equipment: a camera, sample containers, protective gloves, and thick masks. It all looked like a standard, almost routine outing. No one expected that this address, marked on the schedule simply as Maple Street 112, would appear on the front pages of newspapers in a few days. For all participants, this was one of dozens of planned visits. No one then imagined that this particular search would become the point of no return. The moment after which the story of Harold Collins would cease to be a story about a well-kept neighbor. From this moment on, everything that seemed to be part of his normal world would begin to crumble, step by step. When the investigation team arrived on Maple Street in the morning, everything looked deceptively calm. Neat houses, manicured lawns, and evenly trimmed bushes stood all around. Against the backdrop of this quiet, the police car at the Collins gate looked almost like a foreign element. The officers acted strictly according to procedure. They introduced themselves, presented their documents, and read the warrant for the property inspection. Harold came out of the house immediately, as if he had been expecting them. He did not ask what was happening, did not express displeasure, and did not try to object. He listened attentively to the wording, nodded, took the paper, scanned the text, and silently opened the gate to the backyard. All this took less than a minute. His movements were measured, precise, as if rehearsed in advance. A short phrase would later appear in the report. Upon reviewing the documents, Collins remained calm, expressed no objections. To any observer, his reaction looked strange. Usually, homeowners at least ask what is going on, worry, argue, try to stall for time. Harold, on the contrary, looked almost indifferent. He only asked if the officers could go through the backyard right now and added, "Everything is locked up back there, but I'll show you the keys." While the investigation team was inspecting the property, he stood aside, on the porch. He did not ask questions, nor did he try to comment on what was happening. The chemical expert took out a device for air measurements. The device's readings registered an excess of ammonia. One of the officers noted this in a notepad. At that moment, Harold just looked at them and said calmly, "The smell is probably from the fertilizers. I told the inspector about it." No irritation, no anxiety, just mechanical politeness. When the investigator asked where he would be during the inspection, Collins answered without a pause, "I'll be in the kitchen. If you want, I can make you some coffee." The phrase sounded so out of place that it was recorded separately in the report. There was no sarcasm or fear in this offer, rather a habit of acting according to a social formula, as if what was happening did not concern him personally. The investigators would later say that this was the moment that alerted them. Collins' behavior did not match the typical scenario for a person whose property is being searched. He did not defend himself, did not try to convince them, did not show a single emotional reaction. It was a calmness that looked unnatural, as if nothing was happening inside him. While the team was preparing to open one of the barrels, Harold indeed went back into the house. A few minutes later, his silhouette flickered in one of the kitchen windows. He was sitting at the table, a newspaper spread out before him, and was flipping through the pages. He sat like that for almost the entire time the inspection was going on in the yard. Sometimes he would look up, observing through the glass, but his expression did not change. Outside, there was silence, broken only by the sounds of equipment. The expert was taking air samples near the containers. The investigator was taking photographs, and Officer Hine was writing everything down in a log. And all this time, Collins remained inside behind the glass in a familiar posture, elbow on the table, fingers on the newspaper. In the report, this moment is described briefly. During the inspection, the property owner was indoors, engaged in reading printed materials. No emotional reactions were displayed. From a documentation standpoint, nothing unusual. But if you look at it through the eyes of those who were there, the situation looked almost eerie. When the police first entered the backyard, they expected to see a man concerned about what was happening. Instead, they got a figure who seemed to have detached himself from his own reality. Harold Collins, the respected neighbor, the exemplary family man, turned out to be a person capable of meeting a search with icy indifference. This scene would later become key for the investigation. It was from this point that the reassessment of his image would begin. Until that moment, he was just a property owner about whom complaints had been filed. Afterward, a person whose behavior required an explanation. And every word he spoke, every gesture, was now viewed not as a coincidence, but as part of a carefully constructed line of behavior. From this moment, a new line would appear in the case, a psychological one. The investigators would begin to study not only the evidence, but Collins himself, trying to understand who he really was. On that day, they did not yet know that his cold composure was not a coincidence, but a sign that the truth would turn out to be far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The inspection of the backyard began calmly and methodically. The investigators followed the standard protocol, documenting every object with photos and videos. The first things to come into view were 6 identical barrels. Dense plastic, a rich blue color, lined up evenly along a wooden fence. Not a single label, no manufacturer's markings, no signs of rust or dirt. It was as if they had just been delivered. But they had clearly been there for a long time. Imprints had formed in the grass under their bottom rims, and the lids were covered in dust mixed with pollen. Hine noted in his notebook, 6 plastic containers, approximate volume, 200 liters each, hermetically sealed. Lids are plastic welded. No signs of being opened. Such airtightness was suspicious in itself. No gardener would seal containers of fertilizer, especially 6 of them. The expert Powell approached and, without opening them, took a preliminary air measurement. The device immediately registered elevated levels of ammonia and vapors of unknown volatile compounds. For verification, the chemist took out a disposable gas analyzer, activated the sensor, and carefully ran it along the seam of a lid. The indicator flashed yellow, a signal of a possible toxic environment. The inspection procedure was suspended at this point. According to regulations, in such cases, a chemical protection team must be called. Reeves gave the order to move away from the containers, establish a temporary cordon, and not approach closer than 3 meters. All personnel left the backyard, and the area was marked off with plastic tape. By this time, the smell had intensified. It could not be called sharp. Rather, it was dense, viscous, as if saturated with moisture. One of the police officers said it was like a mixture of chlorine and metal. Another replied that it reminded him of old cleaning reagents. No one yet guessed that the source was not a chemical solution at all. 40 minutes later, the hazmat team arrived. 2 specialists in heavy suits, sealed helmets, and with environmental monitoring devices. One was responsible for opening the barrels, the other for documentation and sample collection. The prosecutor's investigator, Lawson, was present nearby, recording every action in the protocol. Before opening, all instruments were checked again. The pressure inside the barrels was abnormal. A slight excess concentration of gas was detected inside. This meant that the contents were in a reactive state. Hine noted the time the operation began: 12:47. The first specialist carefully pried the plastic edge of the lid with a cutter. It took about a minute to make a full circle. The plastic began to give way, and a quiet click was heard. The pressure equalized. At that moment, no one said a word. Everyone stood at a distance, in complete silence, listening only to the hiss of the tool and the crunch of the plastic. When the lid was finally removed, a sharp smell hit the nose even through the filters. From inside, a thick, cloudy yellow liquid with a dense consistency appeared. The hazmat employee turned on a flashlight and aimed the light inside. On the surface of the solution, something dense, unnaturally round, was slowly bobbing. He cautiously stepped back and raised his hand, signaling to stop the process. A few seconds later, he said briefly, "There is an object of biological origin. This phrase would later be included in the report. It became the official record of the moment when a routine environmental check turned into a criminal case. The inspection was immediately halted. The perimeter was expanded to the entire property. The police called in crime scene investigators and a forensic team. Harold Collins was informed that he was being detained pending investigation. The body camera footage shows him calmly nodding, raising his hands and saying, "I understand." No resistance, no attempt to explain, not a single word about what was happening. By this time, the yard was already filled with people, additional patrols, an investigation team, and 2 representatives from the prosecutor's office had arrived. The documentation process began. The barrels were not opened further until the experts arrived, but it was already clear to everyone present that the contents had nothing to do with either reagents or fertilizers. For the official record that day, a dry line was written. During the inspection under warrant number 48, containers containing biological materials of unknown origin were discovered. The objects have been seized and the property owner has been detained. But behind this phrase lay a turning point. It was then that the real investigation began, one that would completely change the perception of Harold Collins and his life. While some officers were sealing off the yard, others were checking the house, documenting every detail. On the kitchen table, the newspaper still lay open. On the stove, a coffee pot was cooling. Everything looked as if the owner had just been distracted for a few minutes. Only now, this image of a neat, calm man no longer inspired trust. Everything around began to seem like part of some carefully constructed illusion that the investigation had yet to peel back, layer by layer. At this stage, the case ceased to be sanitary. It officially received a new status, an investigation into the discovery of human remains. From this moment, criminalists, psychologists, and federal specialists in serial crime investigation were brought in. The story that began with a complaint about a smell was now turning into something much darker and irreversible. The moment of Harold Collins's arrest went by with unexpected simplicity. When he was informed of the suspicion and read his rights, he did not utter a single word. He did not argue, did not ask for clarification, did not demand an explanation. He just nodded, slowly as if confirming something he himself had long known. The report would later state briefly, he offered no resistance. Reaction was calm. No emotional manifestations were observed. He walked to the patrol car without being forced. He sat in the back seat, carefully folding his hands on his knees, and did not make a sound the entire way to the station. The video recording shows him looking out the window, not at the streets, not at the people, but simply into space, as if mentally absent. Externally, it all looked as if he was not being arrested, but politely asked to come along for formalities. When the car stopped at the police building, Collins got out without prompting. The accompanying officer noted in his report, the suspect behaved calmly, complied with all instructions. He showed no signs of aggression or panic. Even during the process of being photographed and fingerprinted, he showed neither irritation nor fear. It felt as though all of this was something expected for him, almost inevitable. The first interrogation began that same evening. The room was standard. A metal table, 2 cameras, a voice recorder. Investigator Reeves and Prosecutor Lawson were present together. On the recording, Reeves can be heard calmly explaining the nature of the accusation, listing the evidence and asking a direct question. Can you explain the origin of the containers found on your property? In response, silence. Not a gesture, not a glance. Only breathing. The investigator asks a second question, a third, a fourth. The reaction is the same. Collins sits motionless, staring at the table. After a minute, he turns his head toward the camera and utters the only phrase of the entire session. "I will only speak in the presence of an attorney." After that, he falls silent again. Not another word, not a question, not an attempt to clarify anything. The investigation stops the interrogation at the 15th minute. According to the rules, further questions are impossible when an attorney is requested. But the pause itself, this silence, turned out to be far more eloquent than any answers. When a lawyer, a young attorney named Peter Hardy, arrived at the station in the morning, he immediately took the initiative. In his first conversation with the press, Hardy stated, "My client has nothing to do with the objects found. He has become a victim of circumstances." A little later, during an official statement, he presented the defense's version. According to the lawyer, Collins did not know about the contents of the barrels. A few months ago, his former colleague, a certain Richard Sloan, had asked to temporarily store some materials for restoration work at his place. Sloan was supposedly involved in restoring old furniture and used chemical solutions to treat the wood. Harold agreed without asking for details and did not even open the barrels. According to the lawyer, the colleague soon left for abroad, presumably Portugal, where by his own account he was planning to start a business. This version looked logical on the surface. Everything was explained simply. An innocent request, trust between former colleagues, carelessness. But the investigation was not in the habit of taking words without verification. The documents provided a name and an approximate date of last contact. An official inquiry was sent through Interpol based on this information. The investigators also examined the connection between Collins and Sloan at their former workplace. Indeed, they were listed in the same department, worked on engineering projects, and even participated jointly in several municipal contracts. But after that, the story began to unravel. At the time of Sloan's supposed move, there was no visa, no tickets, and no confirmation of his departure from the country. His bank account had been inactive for several months. Nevertheless, the defense stood its ground. The lawyer managed to get an independent examination of the substances found, claiming that the barrels could have contained industrial reagents, and the presence of organic remains was explained by a chemical reaction with the environment. He tried to frame the case as a misunderstanding, arguing that it was all a mistake caused by hasty conclusions. Collins, meanwhile, maintained the same line of behavior. He appeared voluntarily for all subsequent interrogations, but never broke his silence. He would sit, listen, sometimes nod, but never said anything beyond the required legal formulas. The investigators privately called him the man with no reaction. However, even this silence became evidence for them. It did not seem like a defense, but a conscious strategy. As if Collins was not just silent, but holding something inside that should not be spoken aloud. From that moment, the investigation definitively entered a new phase. Now, the investigators needed not just to verify his words, but to figure out who this man really was and why 6 sealed barrels, full of chemical horror, had appeared in his life. Once the investigation team had completed its initial inspection of the yard, the crime scene investigators got to work. All 6 containers were seized and transported to the department's laboratory. The transportation procedure was carried out under strict control. Each barrel was placed in a separate container, sealed, and accompanied by an individual protocol. At that moment, no one yet knew how extensive the contents would turn out to be. The results of the examination came back 2 days later. In each of the 5 remaining barrels, specialists found the same thing: organic remains. They were all in a chemical solution similar to the one in the first barrel. The wording in the report was restrained. 6 objects of biological origin have been discovered, presumably of human genetic composition. But behind this dry language lay a fact that immediately changed the course of the investigation. From this point on, the case was no longer a mystery of a single accidental discovery. It became the story of a systematic crime, stretched out over time. experts determined that inside each container were fragments belonging to different people. A preliminary assessment showed that they were dealing with at least 6 separate individuals. For the investigation, this was a turning point. Now it was not about storing chemical waste, not about an accident, and not about a forgotten barrel in a garage. This was a place where the traces of crimes were being concealed. The forensic medical examiners began their work in parallel. Their task was to reconstruct the timeline when each of these people disappeared, how long they had been in the solution, and whether it was possible to establish their identities. The first DNA analysis results came in just a week later. All the samples belonged to women. Their ages ranged from approximately 20 to 40 years old. The chemical environment in which the remains were found complicated identification, but the specialists were able to extract genetic material. The expert report indicated the time of placement in the chemical environment varies from 6 months to 8 years. Traces of dissolving reagents suggest the gradual addition of components for preservation. This meant that the actions were not a one-time event, but were systematic. Someone had carefully thought out a method to hide the evidence, knowing which substances would slow down tissue decomposition and prevent the smell from spreading. At a meeting in the department, Investigator Reeves stated briefly, "We don't have one crime. We have a series." From that moment, the case was officially classified as a serial murder investigation. In the news, this was reported almost casually. Journalists talked about the 6 barrels and the horrifying discovery. But within the investigation team, they already understood 6 was not the limit. If Collins was indeed involved, then they were dealing with a multi-year scheme built on a habit of perfect order. Every step, every detail of his life, from his neat garden to his regular schedules, was now seen in a different light. Meanwhile, the verification of his story about the former colleague continued. Interpol responded to the request a few days later. A person with the specified name and passport details did indeed exist. Richard Sloan, a US citizen and civil engineer, had left the country in February of the previous year. However, there was a note in the Interpol database. Died in Lisbon in June from a heart attack. Case closed. This information put an end to that line of defense. If Sloan had died a year before the barrels were discovered, then he physically could not have brought them or asked for them to be stored. Moreover, in the testimonies of neighbors and colleagues, no one recalled Sloan ever visiting Collins's house. Their professional paths had crossed formally, but no personal contact had been recorded after his resignation. The lawyer tried to build a new line of defense, hinting at the possibility of the evidence being planted, talking about fabricated evidence. But by then, the investigation already had enough facts to deem the version untenable. In Collins's house, they found records of chemical purchases, solvents, preservatives, reagents, everything that was used in the same concentration as in the found containers. The receipts were dated to different years but indicated a stable pattern of purchases. Each new detail only strengthened the main hypothesis. Harold Collins was not an accidental participant in the story. He controlled the process. He knew what he was doing, and he had done it before. His silence was now perceived differently, not as confusion, but as the conscious choice of a man who understands how deep he has gone. From this moment, the investigation definitively focused on reconstructing his life over the past 10 years. All missing women in the county began to be cross-referenced with the timelines from the chemical analyses. The police checked connections, contacts, travel routes, phone billings. The scale of what was being uncovered turned out to be much broader than anyone could have imagined in the first few days. Now the investigation was entering a phase where every fact, every little detail from Harold Collins' life could become a key. His past was no longer just a biography. It was turning into a map that the investigators had to follow to understand how an ordinary man with an impeccable reputation could keep his secret for decades, right in plain sight. After it became clear that the barrels contained the remains of 6 different people, the investigation faced a new task: to determine who they were. It was at this stage that the investigation moved from a phase of shock to one of analytics. The main difficulty lay in the condition of the evidence. The chemical solutions that filled the containers had, over the years, dissolved most of the soft tissues. Visual identification proved impossible. Fingerprints were completely destroyed. In some cases, even the bone structures had undergone partial dissolution. The forensic medical examiners acknowledged that traditional methods would not work. They had to find alternative approaches. The main focus was on molecular examination, DNA analysis, and comparison of dental records with databases of missing persons. In the laboratory, even the smallest fragments of bone matter were isolated to extract genetic material. It was painstaking work, requiring not hours, but weeks. At this stage, specialists from the Central Forensic Center were brought in. They used the latest methods for DNA recovery after exposure to acidic reagents. Each sample was placed in a separate sterile capsule and treated with special enzymes capable of stabilizing the decomposed chains. Despite the difficulty, results gradually began to emerge. The first match was obtained 3 weeks after the analysis began. One of the samples matched the dental records of a woman named Emily Carter. She had been listed as a missing person for 2 years. She was last seen at a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town where she had left her car for repairs. This match was confirmed by a second test. The result was 100% certain. The official wording in the report was dry. Identification of victim number 4, Carter, Emily, 33 years old. Went missing in May 2019. DNA and dental data match confirmed by laboratory. But for the investigators, this entry meant much more than just a name. For the first time, an anonymous discovery was given a story. The police returned to the case files on Emily's disappearance. Back then, 2 years ago, it had all looked like a typical case of vanishing without a trace. The woman had recently moved to the city after a divorce. She worked as a waitress, rented an inexpensive apartment, and was raising a son who was with relatives in another state at the time. Her close circle consisted only of a neighbor and colleagues from the cafe. Everyone described her as quiet, a bit reserved but friendly. According to the police report, Emily disappeared after going to the auto repair shop in the morning. Her car had stopped starting, and she had called an acquaintance for advice on where to get it fixed cheaply. It later turned out that she had used the services of a workshop located a few blocks from Harold Collins's house. According to the mechanic, she had come in that day without an appointment. When the mechanic inspected the car, it turned out the problem was the battery. Collins, who happened to be nearby at that moment, supposedly on company business, offered to help. The mechanic remembered this episode only after the Collins case hit the news. According to him, Harold was polite, courteous, and characteristically refused to take money for the parts, saying that a small thing can be settled later. Emily thanked him and left. No one saw her again. This testimony became the basis for a new episode in the case. Now the investigation understood that the connection between Collins and the victims might not have been accidental at all. He chose his moments, offering help, creating the impression of a benevolent neighbor ready to assist. The same pattern of behavior was observed in other disappearances, about which the police now began to collect data. The experts continued to identify the remaining remains. Each result required weeks of work. One after another, new names appeared, and each one added a stroke to the portrait of the crime. It turned out that all the women belonged to different social strata, were not connected to each other, but they all found themselves in similar life circumstances: financial difficulties, loneliness, lack of support. For the investigators, this pattern became obvious. Collins chose those who were in a vulnerable position. He integrated himself into their lives as a savior, a person who could be relied upon, and that is precisely why none of them became suspicious. His benevolence was not a mask, but a tool. After the confirmation of Emily Carter's identity, the investigation officially linked her disappearance to the Collins case. The news started talking about him again, but now in a different light. Not as a resident on whose property remains were found, but as a person against whom a systemic charge was being built. The work of the criminalists continued around the clock. Each new piece of evidence gradually built a logical chain. It became clear. The barrels were only the final stage of a well-thought-out scheme. The real story began much earlier, with the first acquaintance, the first offer of help, the first benevolent gesture, which was always followed by the same ending. Now the investigation had to find out the main thing: how long this had been going on, and how many more names were hidden in the silence of Harold Collins's backyard. After establishing the identity of the first victim, the investigators moved on to the next obvious step: interrogating Collins's family. First and foremost, his wife, Sarah. She was summoned to the department in the morning, on the same day that the forensic results officially confirmed Harold's connection to the disappearances. According to the detectives, she came without a lawyer, calmly, as if she didn't fully believe that any of this was real. The interrogation video shows Sarah sitting upright, hands on her knees, her gaze fixed on the table. The investigator asked the first question: did she know what was stored in the backyard? She answers without a pause: no, never. He said it was chemicals for the garden. I didn't interfere. Then come the clarifying questions. How often was she in the yard? Did she notice the smell? Did she observe any strange behavior from her husband? The answers sound the same. No. I don't know. He always handled that himself. In her official testimony, she described Harold as a meticulous, neat person who preferred that no one enter certain areas of the house. According to her, he had his own rules. The basement, the shed, and the backyard were his personal territory. She considered it just a masculine habit, seeing nothing suspicious in it. Sarah explained that the smell the neighbors complained about did indeed appear from time to time, but she attributed it to fertilizers. Harold often said he was experimenting with new soil mixtures. Sometimes he would bring home canisters with some liquids, but he assured her that it was all safe. She trusted him. For the investigation, these words marked the beginning of a new line of inquiry. The question arose: could Sarah really have known nothing, living under the same roof with a man who had 6 barrels filled with chemicals and remains in his yard? Or did she, in fact, play a role in his secret? The check began with the most basic steps. The financial department analyzed the family's bank accounts. Not a single large transaction that could point to the purchase of specific chemical reagents was found. All operations looked mundane: groceries, utility bills, school payments, regular donations to the church. Then, investigators examined Sarah's mobile phone records from the past few years. Her locations matched the addresses of her home, work, and school. Not a single call to suspicious numbers. Her messages contained only everyday conversations with relatives, colleagues, and the parent-teacher committee. Her entire life was laid bare, without a single hint of anything hidden. To rule out the possibility of her concealing information, Sarah was sent for a polygraph test. The procedure lasted almost 2 hours. She was asked direct questions. Did she know what was in the barrels? Did she see her husband bring anything into the backyard? Did she overhear conversations that could indicate a crime? The instrument's readings detected no deception. Her reactions remained stable. The investigators still dug deeper. They checked her email, browser search history, and old photos from social media. Nothing. Not a single detail suggesting she could have been aware. On the contrary, it gave the impression that Sarah lived in a perfect illusion of normality, constructed by Harold himself. In parallel, they studied the timeline of her presence at home. It turned out that she spent most weekdays at work, at a local pharmacy where she had been employed for the last 10 years. In the evenings, she often stayed for extra shifts. It was during these times, as further examination showed, that the disappearances occurred. The investigation concluded that it was her busy schedule and her habit of not interfering in her husband's affairs that made what happened possible. Harold created a perfect image of well-being: a stable job, a well-kept house, family weekends, evening walks. Everything looked so ordinary that any alarming detail dissolved into the overall picture of normality. Despite the lack of evidence against Sarah, public opinion quickly became divided. Some believed she couldn't have failed to notice what was happening, while others thought she was simply living next to a man who masterfully concealed his true nature. But in a legal sense, the answer was unequivocal. The official conclusion of the investigators stated, "No data has been found to indicate the awareness or participation of Sarah Collins in the actions qualified as criminal. She has been cleared of suspect status. She is involved in the case as a witness." Thus, the line of a possible accomplice was closed. The investigation acknowledged Harold Collins acted alone. He led a double life, where on the outside he remained an exemplary family man, while in parallel, for many years, he kept a terrible secret in his own home. This conclusion made the whole story even more unbearable. Collins did not just commit crimes. He did it while continuing to live an ordinary life. He had breakfast with his wife, mowed the lawn, went to church, discussed the news with neighbors. All this time, 6 sealed containers stood next to him, and no one, not even the person who slept under the same roof with him, noticed anything. When the investigation definitively rejected the accomplice theory, the investigation entered a new phase. Now the task was different: to understand how he chose his victims, why it all began, and what was really happening behind the facade of Harold Collins's quiet, predictable life. When the experts finished identifying the first 3 victims, the investigation obtained the key: a pattern. Each of them was a woman who found herself in a difficult life situation. None of them belonged to the criminal world, had debts, or enemies. They just happened to be near a man who knew how to read others' weaknesses as easily as he read the newspaper over his morning coffee. The second one identified was a local college student named Laura, young, independent, but financially unstable. After a fight with her parents, she rented a room near campus, worked part-time at a coffee shop, and dreamed of finishing her studies and moving away. She disappeared in the spring. Almost no one noticed right away because, as they said at the dormitory, she often went away to visit friends. It turned out that one of these friends was Harold Collins. During questioning, the coffee shop owner recalled he had come in a couple of times, brought her packages and left tips for everyone. The third was a middle-aged woman who had lost her job after the factory closed. Desperate, she was looking for part-time work, responding to ads. According to the investigation, it was one of these ads for part-time gardening work that led her to Collins. A security camera video from the employment center shows him approaching the counter, offering help and handing over a business card. His manners were impeccable, his speech calm. He knew how to inspire trust from the first few minutes. The fourth was a refugee from Eastern Europe. She didn't speak the language well, lived in a rented apartment, and had almost no friends. The police report states she saw him as a protector. Harold helped her fill out documents, drove her to the grocery store, and advised her on where to find safe housing. According to her neighbors, she called him Mr. Collins, a kind man. No one connected her disappearance to him. By that time, he had already built an image of an exemplary citizen ready to help anyone. All these stories, seemingly unrelated, formed a picture when investigators overlaid the timelines and geography of Collins's movements. He systematically chose those who were weakened by circumstances, loneliness, loss, despair, people who lacked both internal resources and a support network. In each case, he acted the same way. First trust, then involvement, and then a sudden disappearance. Next began the work of finding direct evidence of contact. And here, for the first time, details that Collins had failed to cover up began to surface. One witness reported seeing him help Laura move suitcases from her student dormitory into a truck. According to official records, the girl did not own a car. This meant she was indeed planning to move, and he was the one helping her. Another piece of evidence was found in the archives of the street camera system. A recording from 3 years ago shows a man resembling Collins standing near the employment center. In the background is a woman matching the description of the third victim. He is showing her something on his phone, and they leave the building together. She disappeared that day. Another coincidence was found in bank records. Several fuel payments at the same time but on different highways. Experts speculated that he often gave his acquaintances rides, under the pretext of helping them get home. These trips coincided with the dates of the disappearances. Thus, his method gradually took shape. He did not act impulsively. Each new disappearance was a calculated step. He chose the moment when the person already felt gratitude and trust, and then he simply vanished from their story, erasing his tracks. His dark past was not connected to crime. It was hidden in his habits, in the way he treated people, in the calmness that served as his cover. Psychologists involved in the investigation noted Collins was not a classic maniac in the usual sense. He had no outbursts of rage, no motives of revenge or passion. What distinguished him was a cold rationality. He created situations in which he had complete control. Every step was measured, every detail calculated. When experts identified the sixth victim, the investigation finally understood the scale. She was a woman named Helen Morris. She had disappeared 8 years ago. Her case was quickly closed back then. No witnesses, no evidence, not a single lead. Only now, almost a decade later, did investigators establish that she was the earliest of them all. Helen worked as an accountant at a firm where Collins was a contractor at the time. They had brief professional contact. He was installing ventilation in the office. According to the archives, a few days before her disappearance, she had called him about work-related matters. After that, silence. Her car was found a month later, abandoned by a lake. At the time, no one connected it to him, as Collins had no criminal record, no suspicions. A perfect citizen, a respectable family man, with an excellent reputation. The expert's conclusion was unequivocal. Collins acted consistently for at least 8 years. The cities changed, the victims changed, but the pattern remained the same. He hunted quietly, without leaving a trace, without arousing suspicion. This was not a man who had lost control, but one who had never lost it. Now the investigation had to answer the main question. What was the cause? Why did Harold Collins, outwardly no different from any other suburban resident, choose such a path? To understand this, they had to turn to his past, to his childhood, his family, and the things that usually remain outside the boundaries of other people's biographies. It was there that investigators hoped to find what would explain how this darkness was born. After all 6 victims were identified, the investigators moved to the final, most emotionally difficult stage, a direct confrontation with the man they believed to be guilty. By this point, the evidence was substantial. DNA results, witnesses, video recordings, and coincidences in time and place. But legally, the case remained shaky. Without a confession from Collins himself, everything could turn into a prolonged court battle where any minor detail could destroy the prosecution's case. That is why it was decided to conduct another interrogation, only this time, without the usual procedural formalities, without pressure or threats. The investigators chose a tactic that psychologists call facing the consequences. They did not demand answers. They showed faces, one after another. The interrogation room was cleared of everything unnecessary. On the table, only a lamp, a voice recorder, and a thin folder with materials. Collins was brought in under guard. His handcuffs were removed and he was offered a chair. He sat down calmly as if he had come to a business meeting. The report states, "The suspect's behavior is reserved, with no emotional reactions. Outwardly calm." The investigator began without introductions. From the folder, he took out the first photo, Emily Carter. Her story was told almost like a short obituary. Date of disappearance, location, profession, the people who were waiting for her. After the story, the investigator asked, "Do you remember this woman?" Collins looked at the picture for a few seconds, then shifted his gaze to the wall. The silence lasted a long time. Not a word, not a gesture. Next, the second photo. Laura, the student. The same scenario. The story. The question. The silence. With each new photograph, the tension in the room grew. The investigator did not raise his voice. He spoke calmly, almost restrainedly, but a sense of gravity was felt in every word. The photos changed one after another. The refugee, the accountant, the woman from the employment center. Collins listened without interrupting. Sometimes he nodded, but not like a person admitting guilt, but like someone simply confirming that he understood the meaning of what was being said. His face remained motionless, as if he had detached himself from what was happening. No irritation, no confusion, no defensiveness, only absolute, almost cold, indifference. The report notes, throughout the interrogation, the suspect maintained a neutral facial expression. He showed no visual interest in the photographs. He evaded answering. His behavior is classified as emotional detachment. The investigators tried to break through this wall. They presented facts, call times, recorded routes, coincidences with disappearance locations. Behind every statement stood concrete data. Not a single word was unsubstantiated. But Collins remained motionless. His tactic was clear. He had chosen silence as his weapon. Not to deny, not to justify, not to engage in dialogue. Only silence, in which the logic and emotions of his interlocutors were muffled. On one of the recordings, you can hear the investigator taking a pause, placing the last photograph on the table. Helen Morris, his first victim, the woman who disappeared 8 years ago. "She died first," he said, "and it all started with her. Do you remember what happened then?" No answer followed. The seconds dragged on painfully. You could hear the clock ticking, the rustling of paper. No one spoke. And in that silence, according to those present, Collins suddenly smiled slightly, not mockingly, rather wearily, like a man who has long since made up his mind and has no intention of changing anything. The investigator made one last attempt. He said calmly, without threats, "You don't have to explain how, but at least tell us why." Collins continued to look at the table. Then he raised his eyes, met the investigator's gaze, and said, "Take me back to my cell." Those 4 words were his only reply during the entire interrogation. After them, he stood up, waited for the guard, and left without looking back. The report states, no answer was given to the question of motive. Refused to testify. Behavior: calm, deliberate. After that, the investigators made no more attempts to talk to him. Any communication had lost its meaning. It was obvious that he was not going to defend himself, but he would not let anyone consider him guilty by his own admission either. His silence became part of the case, a fact, just like the physical evidence. Experts later noted, such behavior is typical for people who are not looking for excuses. They control even the process of being accused. It is important for them to retain power, at least over what they say or do not say. For Collins, this silence became the last way to maintain control over his own story. The interrogation concluded with a protocol entry. The suspect requested to stop the procedure and be returned to his cell. The request was granted. The investigators remained in the room for a long time afterward. The lamp illuminated the table on which lay 6 photographs. 6 faces, 6 stories, 6 fates, connected by a single line. Collins had not said a word, but it was his silence that finally convinced the investigation of his guilt. Now the case moved to its final stage, the preparation of the indictment and the transfer of materials to the court. Collins, as before, maintained his icy calm. But behind this calmness, another picture began to emerge. Not just of crimes, but of an entire mechanism built over years. And to understand this mechanism, the investigators decided to turn to what was hidden behind the facade of his life, his past, his childhood, and the things he never spoke about. When the investigation seemed to have hit a dead end, the only remaining direction was Collins's house itself. After weeks of working with evidence, testimonies, and documents, the investigators realized the answer had likely been literally under their feet the whole time. It was decided to conduct another search, but this time not a visual one, as before, but using the latest technology. This time, specialists from the forensic department were brought in, who used ground-penetrating radar, a device capable of scanning the structure of walls, floors, and soil, identifying hidden cavities. The goal was simple: to rule out the possibility that Collins might have left something hidden, documents, tools, or other items that could clarify his motive. The scanning began in the basement. This place had always drawn particular attention from the detectives. Even during the first inspection, it seemed too neat. Unnaturally clean, without a speck of dust, with shelves lined up perfectly, where every box was placed with ruler-like precision. When the device reached the north wall, the screen showed a slight anomaly, an area of density that did not match the rest of the concrete structure. The operator, observing the data, said, "There's a cavity here, about 1/2 meter deep." Immediately after this, the room was cordoned off. Experts carefully chipped away a section of the plaster, and underneath they found a thin panel of cement, clearly not of factory origin. It was glued to the wall with an excessive amount of construction mortar, as if someone wanted not just to hide, but to permanently entomb what was behind it. When the panel was removed, a small metal safe was revealed in the niche. It was old, with a mechanical combination lock. The surface was covered in rust, but the mechanism remained intact. From its appearance, one could tell that the safe had been in this place for more than 1 year. A decision was made on the spot to open it without transporting it, to document everything in the presence of witnesses and on video. One of the experts, using a portable drill and a set of lockpicks, spent almost 20 minutes before the lock gave way. When the door finally opened, a smell of dampness and metallic dust wafted out. Inside lay a wooden box, neatly wrapped in thick paper. No money, no documents, no weapons. Just this box, slightly larger than a shoebox. The experts acted with extreme caution. The box was removed, placed on a table, and opened under the camera. What was inside made everyone present fall silent. Inside lay 6 small items, arranged with almost pedantic precision. 6 driver's licenses, 6 sets of keys, each labeled with a tag bearing initials, and 6 small personal items: a ring, a heart-shaped pendant, an old silver bracelet, a watch, a mother-of-pearl hair clip, and a miniature brooch depicting a bird. Each item seemed to have its own meaning. They were too personal to belong to random people. The investigators understood that this was the very mistake Collins had made. A mistake characteristic not of a criminal, but of a person unable to completely let go of what he had done. Each item was photographed and seized. Within a day, experts confirmed the driver's licenses belonged to the 6 women found in those very barrels. The keys were from the apartments where they lived. And the jewelry was identified by their relatives. The safe became the final, irrefutable link. It proved not only Collins' connection to the victims, but also his conscious involvement. For none of the items could have come into his possession by chance. The report, compiled the next day, stated, "The discovered items indicate the presence of so-called trophies, personal belongings taken from the victims and kept by the suspect. The quantity and nature of the findings confirm the deliberate and systematic commission of crimes." This discovery was a turning point. After months of investigation, numerous versions, hypotheses, and unspoken things, the puzzle finally came together. Collins was no longer just a suspect. He was now the obvious culprit. His silence lost its weight because the object spoke. The fates of 6 women took shape, and the mystery found material proof. The house, which for many years had seemed perfect, turned into a place where every little thing, every detail, from the clean walls to the sealed barrels, hid a monstrous truth. After opening the safe, the investigators understood. Their work was coming to an end. The rest would be a matter for the court. But before handing over the materials, they decided to take one more step, to study Collins's personal records, documents, and archives to try to answer what neither DNA nor forensic science could explain. What drove this man, and why he did all this? As if he were carrying out a plan written only for him. When Collins was brought back to the interrogation room, the atmosphere was already different. This time, in the center of the table, there wasn't a folder with documents or photographs, only a wooden box, the very one taken from the wall of his basement. The metal of the safe, the smell of rust, the paper it was wrapped in, all of it seemed to have absorbed not just physical evidence, but the essence of his secrets. The investigator opened the box without saying any unnecessary words. Slowly, one by one, he took out the 6 driver's licenses. He laid them out on the table. Next to them, 6 sets of keys, 6 personal items, now identified by relatives. Each of them had a name, a story, a life. Collins remained silent as before, but this time his gaze had changed. If he had previously avoided looking at the evidence, now, on the contrary, he couldn't take his eyes off it. At first, a slight tension in his face, almost imperceptible. Then, a short, barely noticeable exhale, as if a person had been holding his breath for too long. The investigator did not rush. He allowed the silence to fill the space. Only after a minute did he speak. "We found them at your place. Everything. 6 people. 6 fates. Why did you keep them?" The words hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. A long pause. The camera recorded every second. Collins lowered his gaze to the table, his fingertips barely touching the pendant, the very one that belonged to Emily Carter. It seemed he was remembering something that existed only in his head. Then he turned his hand slightly as if he wanted to put it back but changed his mind. And then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was quiet, tired, without emotion. The report would later state, spoken in a steady tone, without signs of nervousness. No one was looking for them anyway. After these words, he fell silent. The investigator didn't ask again. There was no point. Everything had already been said. This phrase instantly changed the entire course of the case. It did not contain a direct confession. Collins did not say words that could be interpreted as, "Yes, I did it." But in a legal and psychological sense, this very phrase became the key. It signified not a denial, not an attempt to justify himself, but an acceptance of his own role, as if he had finally acknowledged himself as part of the void he had created. The investigators understood. Behind these words was not a coincidence. This was his logic, twisted, cold, but meticulously constructed. He chose those whom no one would look for, people whose disappearance would not cause alarm, would not make the newspapers, would not become a topic of neighborhood conversations. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a person who had exposed the world's indifference. Psychologists would later say, his ideology was manifested in this phrase. He did not kill for profit or pleasure. He did it out of a conviction that the world is divided into the visible and the invisible, into those whom society notices and those whom it forgets. He chose the latter, because he believed their disappearance would leave no trace. For the investigation, this was the final point. Everything that had previously been only speculation was confirmed. The motive, although not in the form of a confession, finally took shape. When Collins was taken back to his cell, the investigator sat at the table for a long time, not looking at the box. On the recording, he can be heard quietly saying to his colleague, he was telling the truth. No one was really looking for them. After that, there were no more interrogations. All the protocols were compiled and the case moved to the judicial stage. But in the case files, that single line remained, which in essence revealed everything. No one was looking for them anyway. This phrase became not just proof of Collins' guilt, but a symbol of how indifference can become a breeding ground for evil. His words were the last echo from the abyss into which he himself had stepped, and the thing that finally locked the door behind him. When the investigators had gathered all the evidence, witness testimonies, and expert data, a complete picture finally emerged before them. A cold, almost mathematical sequence of actions. Not a fit of madness, not a coincidence, but a scheme polished to perfection. Harold Collins did not act like a man who gave in to an impulse, but like a systematic executor of a meticulously thought-out plan. The first stage was always selection. He never acted spontaneously. His victims were not random. The investigation established, Collins purposefully sought out women who found themselves in difficult life circumstances. Someone had lost a job. Someone had moved to another city. Someone was trying to start over without support. He found them where people are particularly vulnerable, at employment centers, in cheap auto repair shops, on forums, and in local ads. He carefully studied each one, observed them before making the first move. The second stage was establishing trust. Here, Collins performed almost like an actor. He knew how to make the impression of a reliable person, confident, polite, attentive to details, always ready to help, asking for nothing in return. He fixed cars, gave advice, offered rides, listened, and most importantly, he never crossed the line. Everything happened within the bounds of propriety, without pressure. He knew how to make a person feel gratitude, not suspicion. This image of a savior, a man who just wants to help, became his main tool. The investigators found that this period could last for weeks. He patiently built a connection, and when trust was established, he moved to the next step. The third stage was isolation. Collins never operated on someone else's territory. He always invited the victim to a place where he felt in control of the situation. Most often, this was his house or garage, places where no one entered without his permission. He would find a pretext to help with a car, to pick up a tool, to show how to fix something. And that was his whole calculation. He never used force. Everything looked natural, calm. The person came willingly. What happened after? The investigation could only establish partially. But it was obvious that everything happened quickly and without chaos. Collins meticulously controlled the process. There were no outbursts or panic. He did everything cold-bloodedly, knowing exactly how to cover his tracks. This was the fourth stage, the moment when the plan reached its climax. And then, what the investigators called the concealment stage. It was distinguished by an almost pathological neatness. Collins used chemical reagents that destroyed any traces. All processes, from destroying evidence to sealing the barrels, were thought out in advance. He acted like a person who had been briefed. He left no fingerprints, did not use his own delivery methods, and destroyed the tools. After each incident, he cleaned up everything that could be a reminder of what had happened, and only the personal items, those very trophies, he kept for himself. For him, this was not proof, but a symbol of control. This sequence of actions was repeated time and again, 6 times in 8 years, without a single mistake. Investigators noted that he never tried to change the scheme. He did not experiment, did not improvise. It was a ritualistic structure, where each stage had its own meaning. Psychologists involved in the case said that his behavior was not like the passion of a criminal, but the cold routine of one. It was as if he was performing a task in which there were neither emotions nor doubts. In every action, logic; in every detail, repetition. Collins did not just commit crimes. He turned them into a cycle in which he himself became part of the mechanism. In the reports, this was called methodicalness, bordering on obsession. He did not seek risk, did not crave fame, did not leave messages. His trophies were the only thing that revealed him not as an executor, but as a person who needed confirmation of his own power. Thus, the investigation concluded. His modus operandi was not an impulse, but a system. Clear, repeatable, without emotion. Everything he did followed the same pattern. And it was this that allowed him to remain unnoticed for so long. The reconstruction concluded with a finding that sent a chill down the spine. Harold Collins had been active for 8 years, turning each disappearance into a precise, almost mechanical ritual. And when this ritual was finally uncovered, the investigators realized the most difficult part lay ahead. Trying to explain why. When Harold Collins' case went to trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was almost palpable. In the dock sat a man who had lived a double life for 8 years, smiling at neighbors, going to church with his wife, and hosting barbecues in his yard. But now he sat motionless, his hands folded, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. Around him were journalists, cameras, and the families of the deceased, and complete silence when the first hearing began. The defense understood that denying the obvious was pointless. Too many facts linked Collins to the crimes. Therefore, their strategy was built on something else, on trying to prove that there was still no direct evidence of his guilt. They did not deny the discovery of the barrels, the safe, or the personal belongings. They did not dispute the forensic data. But they argued, yes, all of this was found in his house, but it does not prove that he committed the murders. The lawyer pointed to the absence of witnesses, to the fact that Collins's DNA was not found on the victim's belongings. He built a defense around the image of a victim of circumstances, claiming that the evidence could have been planted, and his client's silence was not an admission of guilt, but a way to avoid manipulation. The prosecution, however, approached the case differently. Their position was not based on a single detail, but on the overall picture. Each piece of evidence, in itself, not absolute proof. But together, they formed a clear, flawless system. Step by step, the prosecutor laid out the logic of the crimes before the jury, from the selection of victims to the concealment of evidence. He showed photographs, records, witness testimonies, and camera footage. Everything that could explain how an outwardly calm man could grow into a person capable of monstrous acts. A particularly powerful moment came when the prosecutor took the wooden box out of a clear evidence bag, the very one found in the basement wall. He placed it before the jury, opened the lid, and said, "These are not just things. They are the memory of those who are no longer with us. And this is what he chose to keep." Those words changed everything. The victims' relatives could not hold back their tears. Collins, as before, did not make a sound. He listened, without blinking, as if he were attending someone else's trial. During the proceedings, psychologists called by the prosecution explained his behavior. They said his silence was not a defense, but a demonstration of power. He did not want to justify himself. He wanted to have the last word, even if it was silence. When it was time for closing arguments, the prosecutor uttered a simple phrase. "We cannot bring back those he took, but we can ensure that he never walks outside these walls again." The jury deliberated for a little over 2 hours. That day, the courtroom was packed. When they returned, everyone stood. The jury foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. Collins's expression did not change. No surprise, no outrage. He just nodded, a barely perceptible gesture, as if he had heard what he expected. The next day, the judge read the sentence. His voice was calm, without emotion. Harold Collins is sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At that moment, silence once again fell over the courtroom. Sarah Collins, his wife, sat in the front row. She did not cry. She only lowered her head and did not lift it until the end of the hearing. Thus ended the most high-profile trial in recent years, without a confession, without remorse, without any attempt at justification. The court ruled. Guilt was proven. Punishment was inevitable. But even after the verdict, the investigators were left with a feeling that Collins's story was not over. Too much about his life remained unclear, from his motives to the possibility of other victims that no one knew about. And ahead of them lay new work, to understand not only what he did, but why. After the trial, when the cameras left the building and the loud headlines began to fade, a strange, oppressive silence settled over the town. But this silence was not one of peace. Rather, it was a prolonged exhale, usually followed by realization. People suddenly understood. Everything they had seen and heard over the past few months had happened right next to them. Harold Collins had lived among them, walked the same streets, bought groceries at the same stores, greeted his neighbors. This thought was unsettling, because if a monster can hide behind the image of an ordinary person, then no one is safe. The Collins family was the first to feel the consequences of this nightmare. Sarah Collins, once a friendly woman with a gentle voice, no longer appeared in public. Throughout the trial, she sat in a back row, avoiding the cameras, and answered calls from acquaintances less and less. With each new hearing, something in her face seemed to dim. When the verdict was announced, she did not cry. She just stood up, lowered her head, and left without saying a word. A few weeks later, it became known. She had filed for divorce, given up the house, and changed her surname. Journalists later found out that she had moved away with the children, though only initials were listed on the moving documents. The trail of her new life was lost somewhere on the state line. No database listed a person with her former name anymore. Psychologists would later say that such actions are a form of survival, a complete severance from the past, an attempt to erase from memory not only her husband, but also herself as the person she was beside him. For a long time, the town could not decide what to do with the house on Maple Street. On one hand, it was ordinary real estate, albeit with a horrific history. On the other, it was the place where the barrels were found, where forensic investigators in hazmat suits worked, where the whole horror seemed to have seeped into the walls. No one wanted to move in. No real estate company would take on the sale. People avoided the property, especially at night. Gradually, the house began to attract a different kind of visitor. First, curious teenagers who would sneak over at night to see what it was like. Then, bloggers filming unsettling videos. Some would leave notes with the victims' names on the fence. Some would leave candles on the porch, and others, on the contrary, would paint offensive graffiti on the walls. The neighboring residents grew tired of the constant visits. The authorities received complaints, noise at night, trash, camera flashes. The neighborhood was slowly turning into a grim tourist attraction, and this disgusted people. A year after the sentencing, the municipal council held a closed meeting. There was only one item on the agenda: the fate of the Collins house. That day, a decision was made. The property would be demolished. The house was declared a public nuisance, and the mortgage bank agreed to transfer ownership to the city. A month later, workers arrived at the site. None of the neighbors were notified in advance, to avoid a crowd. In the morning, as the first rays of sun lit up the facade, the roar of an excavator echoed down the street. Within a few hours, the walls that had recently held family photos were reduced to a pile of bricks. People stood at a distance. Some filmed on their phones. Others just watched. It was said that at the moment the last wall fell, a cloud of dust rose over the house, resembling smoke. And this sight made a strong impression on everyone. It was as if not just a building had disappeared, but with it, something invisible, dark, that had held the entire neighborhood in its grip. And then something no one expected happened. For several weeks, the lot stood empty, overgrown with weeds, until the victims' relatives came. They brought flowers, white and lilac, in identical clay pots. They placed them in a row, right where the front porch used to be. A couple of days later, activists came, then neighbors. People started bringing saplings, seeds, and plaques with names. The city did not intervene. It all happened on its own, naturally. Thus, on the site of the demolished house, a small memorial park was born. Now, 6 young maple trees grow there, one for each victim. Between them is a neat path of light-colored stone and a wooden bench where someone is always sitting. Sometimes it's passers-by, sometimes it's relatives of those whose names are engraved on the metal plaque at the entrance. It has only a few words. To those he thought were invisible. They were found. Every spring, on the anniversary of the sentencing, people bring flowers there. Someone reads poetry. Someone just sits in silence. On this day, the town tries not to remember Collins. Only those whose names now live on in bronze. Over the years, the place has ceased to be a reminder of the crime. It has become a reminder of memory. There is no longer a sense of fear here. No ominous shadow that once seemed to hang over this neighborhood. On the contrary, it is one of the quietest and most well-kept places in the county. They say that in the evening, when the streetlights come on and the leaves of the trees rustle in the wind, it feels as if the town has finally exhaled. And in this, there is a strange kind of justice. Where a house of evil once stood, a garden now grows, created by the hands of those who endured grief. And perhaps this is the true victory, not over a man, but over his darkness.